1919, Red Canyon Ranch, Arizona. The cottonwood tree had stood for longer than memory. Its branches spread wide against the autumn sky, casting shadows that moved like breathing across the porch where Jacob Hartwell sat with his grandson. The boy was 16, all elbows and questions the way young men are when the world still seems knowable. Jacob's hands shook slightly as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. 65 years had worn him down to bone and sinew, but his eyes remained clear, the kind of clear that comes from seeing too much and remembering all of it. "Grandfather," the boy said, "you promised to tell me about grandmother, how you met her." Jacob set the pot down carefully. Steam curled between them like ghosts finding their way home. "To understand how I met your grandmother," he said, his voice rough as wind through canyon stone. "You've got to know what happened 20 years before that, spring of 1879. I was 25 years old, newly married to your great-aunt Margaret, and thought I knew everything worth knowing about this land." The old man's eyes shifted to the cottonwood, to the small marker beneath it that bore Margaret's name. "The flood taught me different." The air between them seemed to shift, time folding back on itself, like water finding its old course. Jacob closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, he was no longer sitting on that porch. He was riding through rain that felt like the sky trying to wash Arizona territory clean of every living thing. April 1879, Red Canyon. At 25, Jacob Hartwell was all muscle and confidence. His beard was full and dark, his hands already calloused from 2 years of building a ranch from nothing but rock and hope. The bay gelding beneath him moved steady through a mud that sucked at its hooves with every step. Rain fell in sheets that turned the world gray. Thunder rolled across the valley like artillery fire, though Jacob was too young to have heard real artillery. That would come later, carried home in other men's stories. 3 days of rain had swollen Red Creek beyond anything the old-timers remembered. Jacob had spent the morning checking his small herd, counting heads, making sure none had wandered into the low ground where water was beginning to claim territory that had been dry for 40 years. Margaret had wanted to come with him. She usually did. At 23, she was stronger than most men gave her credit for, with her quarter Apache blood and her grandmother's medicine knowledge. But this morning, Jacob had refused. "Too dangerous," he'd said, kissing her forehead at the door of their small cabin. "I'll be back before dark." She'd touched his face with both hands the way she did when she was worried, but wouldn't say it. "Some of the children from my reading class live across the creek," she'd told him. "The White Feather family. If the water rises much more, they won't make it home." That was how Margaret thought. Always about others first. "I'll check on them," Jacob had promised. "Make sure everyone's across safe." Now, 3 hours later, he was finding families huddled on high ground, their belongings salvaged in whatever they could carry. Most had made it across the creek before it became impassable. But one family was missing, the White Feathers. Jacob knew them slightly. Running Elk, the father, had helped him track stolen horses the previous summer. Good man, quiet. Had a wife and 2 small children. Their camp should have been just around the next bend, where a stand of cottonwoods offered shelter near the creek's edge. Should have been. Past tense. Because when Jacob rode around that bend, there was nothing but water and debris. The camp was gone, swept away. Belongings scattered across the current like leaves in a gutter. And in the middle of all that churning brown water, clinging to a cottonwood branch that bent and cracked with each surge, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her long black hair was plastered to her skull. Her dress, traditional Apache, clung to her small frame. She was screaming, but the rain and the water swallowed most of the sound. What reached Jacob's ears was high and desperate and terrified. The branch bent further. It was going to break, any second now. Jacob didn't think. There wasn't time for thinking. He swung down from his horse, his boots hitting mud with a wet slap. His lariat rope was already in his hands, 60 feet of braided rawhide that had pulled cattle from bogs and helped build the fences that marked his land. There was a fence post 20 feet back, driven deep into earth, that was still solid. Jacob tied one end of the rope around his waist with a bowline knot his father had taught him when he was younger than the girl drowning in front of him. The other end he secured to the post with a double half hitch. The knots would hold. Probably. The post might not. The rope might break. The current might take them both. But a man didn't ride past a drowning child. That wasn't something Jacob's father had to teach him. That was just what men did. He waded in. The water hit him like a fist cold, despite the season strong enough to make him stagger. The current pulled at his legs, trying to sweep his feet out from under him. The rope around his waist went taut, and Jacob felt the post creak behind him. Hold, he thought. Just hold. He pushed deeper. The water reached his waist, then his chest. The girl was still 20 feet away, and the branch she clung to was making sounds no living wood should make. "Hold on," Jacob shouted, though she probably couldn't hear him. "I'm coming." Another step. The bottom dropped away beneath his right foot, and suddenly he was swimming the rope, the only thing keeping him from being swept downstream. He pulled himself forward hand over hand, along the rope, fighting the current with every inch. 15 feet, 10 feet. The girl's eyes found his wide and dark, and filled with more terror than any child should know. The branch cracked. Not broke, not yet, but the sound cut through even the roar of water. Jacob lunged forward, his hand outstretched. The rope burned around his waist as it took his full weight, plus the current's force. His fingers brushed the girl's arm, missed, tried again. The branch broke. For one terrible second the girl was in the water, tumbling, going under. Then Jacob's hand closed around her wrist, thin as a bird's bone beneath his grip. He pulled her to him, wrapping his other arm around her small body as the current tried to tear them both away. She was so light. Even waterlogged, she weighed almost nothing, but the current didn't care. It pulled, and Jacob felt the rope stretch, felt the post behind him groan. He used the current instead of fighting it, let it swing them toward the bank, used his legs to push off submerged rocks, felt the rope guide them in like a fishing line, reeling and catch. His knees hit solid ground, then his hands. He crawled up the bank, still holding the girl, pulled them both clear of the water, and collapsed in the mud. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain and the ragged pull of breath in his lungs. The girl was shaking in his arms, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Jacob pulled off his coat, heavy with water, but still warmer than nothing, and wrapped it around her. "You're safe," he told her, though he didn't know if she spoke English. "You're safe now. I've got you." She looked up at him with eyes that had seen her whole world wash away. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Jacob held her closer, sharing what warmth his body had left. The rain continued to fall, but softer now, as if even the sky was exhausted. "Mama," the girl finally whispered. "Papa." Jacob's chest tightened. He looked back at the churning creek, at the debris still tumbling past in the current. No one else had been on that branch. No one else had been screaming. He knew what that meant. She was too young to fully understand it yet, but she would. Soon enough she would. "Stay brave, little one," Jacob heard himself say. The words came from somewhere deeper than thought. "You're safe now. Stay brave, and you'll make it through anything life throws at you." She buried her face against his chest and shook. The ride back to the ranch took an hour. Jacob wrapped the girl in front of him on the saddle, his coat still around her shoulders, his arms keeping her steady. She didn't speak, didn't cry. Just stared ahead with eyes that had gone somewhere far away, somewhere beyond the rain. Margaret saw them coming from the cabin window. She was outside before Jacob could dismount, her hands already reaching for the child. "Dear God," Margaret breathed. "Jacob, what happened?" "Flood took the White Feather Camp," Jacob said, climbing down slow, every muscle aching from the fight with the current. "Found her in the water. Haven't found anyone else." Margaret's face went pale. She knew what that meant, too. She took the girl, gently murmuring words in Apache that Jacob didn't understand, but recognized as comfort. The girl's eyes flickered at the familiar language, the first sign of recognition since the rescue. Inside the cabin, Margaret worked with practiced efficiency. She stripped the girl's wet clothes, wrapped her in blankets, sat her by the fire. She made tea with herbs from her medicine bag, sweet and warm, and coaxed the child to drink. Jacob stood near the door, watching. He'd done the hard part, the pulling from water, the keeping alive. This part, the gentle part, the healing part that was Margaret's gift. "What's your name, little one?" Margaret asked in English, her voice soft. The girl looked at her for a long moment. When she spoke, her English was broken, but clear enough. "Naomi," she said. "Naomi Whitefeather." "Naomi," Margaret repeated like she was tasting the name, learning its shape. "That's beautiful. Do you know what happened to your parents, Naomi?" The girl's face crumpled. She nodded but didn't speak. Margaret pulled her close, and this time the tears came. Great racking sobs that shook the girl's small frame. Margaret held her through all of it, rocking slowly, humming something low and wordless that might have been Apache or might have been older than that. Jacob turned away to give them privacy. Through the window he could see the rain beginning to ease. The storm was passing, but the damage was done. That night, after Naomi had cried herself into exhausted sleep in their bed, Margaret joined Jacob on the porch. They sat in silence for a while, listening to water drip from the roof. "I'll ride out at first light," Jacob said. "Look for the parents, for the boy too. She said she had a younger brother." Margaret nodded. Her hand found his in the darkness. "She's so small," Margaret whispered. "So alone." "We'll find her family," Jacob said. "Someone survived." But he wasn't sure he believed it. Present 1919. The old man on the porch paused in his telling. His grandson was leaning forward now, coffee forgotten, caught in the story, the way young men get caught when they finally hear the truth behind the legends. "Did you find them?" the boy asked. "The parents," Jacob nodded slowly. "Next day. Samuel Ironwood and I rode out as soon as there was light enough to see by. Found the father's body 2 miles downstream, caught in a logjam. Found the mother and the baby another mile past, that washed up on a sandbar." He paused, and his hand shook harder enough that he had to set his cup down. "Naomi stayed with us for a week while we searched for her brother or other family. Thomas, the boy, was with his grandmother in a different camp. Took us 7 days to get word to them." "So you gave her back?" "Had to," Jacob said. "She was Apache. She belonged with her people." Margaret understood that, even though it broke her heart. Broke mine too, if I'm honest. The old man's eyes went distant again, remembering. The day they came to take her, Naomi clung to Margaret and wouldn't let go. Her grandmother was old and stern and traditional. She said Naomi needed to be with her own kind, learn the old ways. And she was right. We had no claim on that child except the one made in water and fear. "But you let her go." "Of course we did. She wasn't ours to keep. But before she left, I knelt down and looked her in the eyes, and I reminded her of what I'd said in the water." Jacob's voice grew quiet, and she looked at me with those big dark eyes and said in her broken English, "I come back when I strong. I come back and thank you." Jacob smiled, though his eyes were wet. I told her she didn't owe me anything, but she shook her head and said, "I owe everything. I promise. I find you. I come back." "Did she?" the boy asked, though he already knew the answer. He'd seen his grandmother, seen the way she moved through the world like she'd walked far to get here and meant to stay. 20 years later, Jacob said, to the day near as we could figure. Autumn of 1899. Another storm rolling in just like that one. And I was standing in the barn when I heard a horse coming up the trail. He paused, letting the silence stretch. But that's a story for another telling. Right now, I want you to understand something important. The old man reached out and gripped his grandson's shoulder with fingers that were still strong despite their shaking. That flood in 1879 didn't just save one little girl. It set everything else in motion. It brought your grandmother into my life twice, once as a child to save, once as a woman to save me back. And this land, all of Red Canyon, it remembers. It holds on to these things. Every drop of water, every promise made, every life pulled from death. The boy looked toward the cottonwood tree, toward the graves beneath it. "The land remembers everything," Jacob said softly, "and so do I." In the distance, thunder rumbled, another storm coming. But Jacob wasn't afraid of storms anymore. He'd learned long ago that sometimes storms brought loss, and sometimes they brought gifts, and you couldn't have one without risking the other. That was just how life worked on the frontier. You stood your ground, you kept your promises, and you stayed brave even when the water rose higher than you ever thought possible. The rest, as the old man would tell his grandson over the days to come, was just a matter of holding on until the current brought you home. 1919, Red Canyon Ranch. The grandson shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. The sun had moved lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the porch. Jacob refilled both their cups, the coffee still hot from the pot. Margaret, no Naomi, his wife, had left, warming on the stove before she went to tend the garden. "So she came back," the boy prompted, 20 years later. Jacob nodded slowly, settling back into his chair with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to respect his bones. "She did, but those 20 years in between, they weren't kind to either of us. You need to understand that too, if you're going to understand what happened when she rode up that trail." The old man's gaze drifted toward the cottonwood again, toward the grave that held his first wife. 5 years after we gave Naomi back to her grandmother, Margaret got sick. 1884, Red Canyon Ranch. Margaret had been complaining of tiredness for months. At first, Jacob thought it was just the hard work of ranch life, the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and tending the vegetable garden she'd planted behind the house. But by summer, she couldn't hide it anymore. The cough came first, then the weight loss, then the pain that made her double over when she thought Jacob wasn't looking. The doctor in Santa Fe was a thin man with wire spectacles who examined Margaret with gentle hands and gave Jacob the news with eyes that held too much practice at delivering death sentences. "Cancer," he said simply. "Somewhere in her stomach or lungs, hard to say which. There's nothing to be done." "How long?" Jacob asked, his voice steady, even though his world was ending. 6 months, maybe 10 if she's strong." Margaret was strong. She lasted almost a year. Jacob watched her fade like color bleeding from fabric left too long in the sun. She got thinner, frailer, until the woman who'd helped him build fence lines and break horses was too weak to lift a water bucket. But her spirit never diminished. Even at the end, lying in their bed with her skin gone pale as paper, she still found ways to smile. "Promise me something," she whispered one night, her hand light as bird bones in his. "Anything," Jacob said, and meant it. "Don't give up on this land, on life. Don't become one of those men who buries his heart with his wife." Jacob tried to speak, but his throat closed up. "Promise me you'll let someone in again." Margaret continued, each word an effort. "When the time is right, when the right person comes, don't shut yourself away." "I promise," Jacob managed, though he couldn't imagine ever keeping it. Margaret died 3 days later on a morning when the cottonwood outside their window was full of birds singing like nothing in the world had changed. Jacob buried her beneath that tree, dug the grave himself, with hands that blistered and bled, and carved her name into a piece of wood that he planned to replace with stone when he could afford it. He never did replace it. Somehow the simple wooden marker seemed more honest. 1919, the porch. "For 15 years I was alone, talked more to horses than people." Jacob paused. "Then autumn of 1899 came. I was 45 gray in my beard. That's when everything changed." His face softened with the memory. "Shows what I knew." September 1899. Red Canyon Ranch. The storm came in just before sunset, the way storms did in Arizona when the season started to turn. Jacob was checking the cattle, making sure none had wandered into the low ground where Red Creek ran. The creek was mostly dry this time of year, but you could never be too careful. He found a young calf stuck in a ravine, bleeding pitifully, its mother pacing above. Getting it out took the better part of an hour, and by the time Jacob had the animal safely reunited with its mother, rain was falling, and his joints ached in ways they hadn't 20 years before. 45 wasn't old, but it wasn't young either, not out here where hard work aged a man faster than calendar years. Jacob returned to the barn, wet and tired, his clothes plastered to his skin, his hat dripping water like a roof with holes in it. He settled the calf in dry hay, covered it with a blanket, and stood there for a moment listening to the rain drum against the barn walls. It reminded him of that other storm, the one that had brought Naomi into his life and then taken her away again. He wondered sometimes what had happened to her, if she'd survived the hard years on the reservation, if she'd married, if she remembered him at all. Probably not. Children forgot. It was a blessing, Margaret used to say, the ability to leave pain behind and move forward. Jacob walked to the cabin through a rain that was easing now, the worst of the storm already passing. He'd make coffee, maybe heat up some beans, eat alone at the table like he'd done for 15 years. Another night no different from the 1,000 that came before. Except this night was different. As he reached the porch, Jacob saw movement on the southern trail, a rider approaching through the rain. His hand drifted to the Colt Peacemaker at his belt. The rider came closer. A woman on a paint mare moving with the confidence of someone born to the saddle. Long black hair hung wet down her back, leather skirt, beaded sash, Apache. She stopped at the gate, dismounted, and stood looking at him across the yard. Then she spoke. Mr. Hartwell, Jacob Hartwell of Red Canyon Ranch. Her voice was steady, calm, with an accent that spoke of someone who'd learned English well, but not first. Jacob stepped off the porch, his hand still near his gun, out of habit more than fear. "That's right," he said. "Do I know you, ma'am?" She took a step closer, and even in the fading light, Jacob could see her face clearly now. She was young, maybe late 20s, with strong features and dark eyes that looked at him with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "You did once," she said. "20 years ago, you pulled a little Apache girl from a flood. You told her to stay brave." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He stared at the woman in front of him, searching for the child he'd rescued in that face, and slowly, incredibly, he found her. The same eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. Older, harder shaped by years he knew nothing about, but unmistakably her. "Naomi," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, and something in her expression shifted, softened. "My name is Naomi Whitefeather. I was 8 years old when you saved me. I've been looking for you ever since." The rain had stopped completely now. Water dripped from the porch roof, from the brim of Jacob's hat, from the branches of the cottonwood tree. In the silence that followed her words, Jacob could hear his own heartbeat loud and irregular in his chest. "You've been looking for me," he managed, "for 20 years. "Not every day," Naomi said, a small smile touching her lips. "But yes, whenever I could. Whenever I heard about a rancher named Hartwell or a man who'd saved an Apache child from a flood. The territory is big and the trail went cold more times than I can count. But I kept looking." Jacob realized he was staring and tried to collect himself. Years of isolation had left him unpracticed at normal human interaction, let alone something like this. "I don't understand," he said. "Why I pulled you from the water, yes, but that was a long time ago. You don't owe me anything." Naomi's expression grew more serious. "May I come in? It's been a long ride, and what I have to say deserves more than a conversation in your yard." Jacob nodded, still too stunned to do much else. He took her horse's reins and led the animal to the barn, giving himself a few minutes to process what was happening. Naomi followed him, watching as he unsaddled the mare and rubbed her down with practiced efficiency. "You take good care of your animals," Naomi observed. "Animals don't complicate things," Jacob said, then realized how that sounded. "I mean, they're honest. You feed them, treat them right, they return the favor. Unlike people." Something like that. When the horse was settled with feed and water, Jacob led Naomi to the cabin. Inside, he lit the lamps and started a fire in the hearth, his hands moving through familiar routines while his mind raced with questions he didn't know how to ask. Naomi stood near the fireplace, looking around the small space. Her eyes lingered on the photographs on the mantel, particularly one of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Your wife?" she asked. "Was," Jacob said. "Margaret. She passed 15 years ago." "I'm sorry." Jacob busied himself making coffee, needing something to do with his hands. When he finally sat down across from Naomi at his small table, two steaming cups between them, the silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. "You said you've been looking for me," Jacob finally said. "Why?" Naomi wrapped her hands around her cup, not drinking, just holding it like she needed the warmth. "Do you remember what you told me that day?" she asked. "When you pulled me from the water?" Jacob tried to think back. The memory was there, vivid in some ways, blurred in others. He remembered the cold, the fear, the weight of the child in his arms. But his exact words, "I'm not sure," he admitted. "You said, 'Stay brave, little one. You're safe now. Stay brave and you'll make it through anything life throws at you.'" The words sounded familiar in her voice, like an echo of something he'd once known. "I held on to those words," Naomi continued, her dark eyes fixed on his. "When my grandmother took my brother and me back to the reservation, when my mother's death became real instead of just a nightmare, when the government moved us from camp to camp like we were cattle, I remembered what you said. Stay brave." She paused, taking a breath. "My grandmother died when I was 15. She was old and the winters were hard, and one morning she just didn't wake up. My brother Thomas was only 11. I had to raise him, had to keep us both alive. And every time I thought I couldn't do it, every time I wanted to give up, I heard your voice in my head, 'Stay brave.'" Jacob felt something tighten in his chest. He'd had no idea. The child he'd saved for a few minutes had carried his words for 2 decades. "What happened to Thomas?" he asked. A shadow crossed Naomi's face. "He joined the cavalry as a scout when he was 14, lied about his age, said he wanted to prove himself in the white man's world. I haven't seen him in 8 years. I'm sorry." "Don't be. He made his choice. I made mine." "Which was," Naomi looked at him steadily, "to learn to survive, to become someone who could help others the way I was helped. I apprenticed with a medicine woman, learned the healing arts, plants, poultices, how to set bones, how to bring down fevers. I traveled from camp to camp, settlement to settlement, helping where I could. And I searched for you." Jacob shook his head, still trying to understand. "But why, Naomi, I appreciate what you're saying, but pulling you from that flood was just what any man would have done. You don't need to thank me for it 20 years later." "I didn't come to thank you," Naomi said quietly. Jacob waited. "I came to stay." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Jacob felt his world tilt slightly, the careful isolation he'd built over 15 years suddenly threatened by 4 simple words. "Stay," he repeated. "Here, if you'll have me." "I don't understand. You can't just decide to stay with a stranger." "You're not a stranger. You're the man who gave me life. Twice. Once when you pulled me from the water. Once when you gave me words to live by." Jacob stood up, needing to move to think. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkness beyond. "Naomi, I've been alone a long time. I'm not good company. Ask anyone in Copper Springs. They'll tell you I'm half wild, barely civilized, more comfortable with horses than people." "I've been alone too," Naomi said behind him, "since I was 8 years old. Oh, I've been surrounded by people, lived in camps and towns, tended the sick and the dying, but alone, always alone. No home, no family, just moving from place to place like tumbleweed." Jacob turned to face her. "And you think this place, this ranch in the middle of nowhere with a 45-year-old hermit is going to change that?" Naomi stood, meeting his eyes with a directness that reminded him of Margaret. "I think this is where I'm supposed to be. I don't know why I'm so certain, but I am. From the moment I heard you were still here, still working this land, something in me knew. This is home. Or it could be if you'll let it." Jacob wanted to say no, wanted to protect the careful numbness he'd cultivated over 15 years. But something in Naomi's eyes, something in the way she stood there, asking for nothing but a chance, made the refusal stick in his throat. "I have a guest room," he heard himself say, "across the hall. It's not much, but it's clean. You can stay there, for now, until you figure out what you really want." "I already know what I want." "Stay anyway. Give it time. Give me time." Naomi nodded slowly. "All right, time. But Jacob—" "Yes. I didn't ride 200 miles and search for 20 years to give up easy. I'm patient. I can wait." Jacob showed her to the guest room, a small space with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out toward the cottonwood tree. He left her there with a lamp and a blanket, then returned to his own room feeling more unsettled than he'd been in years. He lay in bed listening to the sounds of another person in his house. The creak of floorboards, the soft splash of water from the basin, small sounds he hadn't heard since Margaret died. For the first time in 15 years, Jacob Hartwell went to bed knowing someone else was breathing under the same roof. And for the first time since Margaret's death, the silence didn't feel quite so loud. 1919, the porch. The grandson was leaning forward in his chair, now completely absorbed. "You just let her stay." "Just like that," Jacob smiled. "Not just like that. We danced around it for a while. But yes, eventually. She needed a home. I needed to remember how to be human. Seemed like we might be able to help each other. But you fell in love with her. Not right away. That came later. First we had to learn to trust each other, and then we had to survive what came next." The boy's eyes widened. "What came next?" Jacob looked toward the western horizon where the sun was getting lower. "Copper Springs? We needed supplies and I couldn't hide her forever. So 3 days after she arrived, we rode into town together. And that's when the real trouble started." He paused, his face hardening at the memory. "You see, some people in Copper Springs didn't take kindly to an Apache woman staying at my ranch. One man in particular, Curtis Mallory. He owned half the territory and wanted the other half, and he'd had his eye on Red Canyon for years." The old man's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "When he saw Naomi riding beside me, he saw an opportunity, a way to question my right to the land, a way to stir up fear and prejudice, a way to take what I'd built." "What did he do?" Jacob's eyes went cold. "He called her my squaw, right there on Main Street, loud enough for everyone to hear. Said I was following in Margaret's footsteps, taking up with Indians, disgracing the town." "What did you do?" The old man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I put him on his back in the mud, told him if he spoke about either of those women again, I'd put him in the ground next to Margaret so she could teach him some manners." The grandson let out a low whistle. "Grandmother saw that." "She did. And you know what she said afterward?" "What?" "She said, 'I've heard worse. You didn't need to defend me.' And I told her, 'Maybe not, but I wanted to.' That's when I knew." "Knew what?" Jacob looked at his grandson, his old eyes bright. "That I was going to love her. That maybe I already did. That Margaret had been right. The right person had come. And I was done hiding." The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, Naomi emerged from the garden, a basket of vegetables on her hip, walking toward the house with the steady grace that had first caught Jacob's eye 20 years before. "Of course, loving her and keeping her safe turned out to be two different things," Jacob said quietly. "Mallory didn't take kindly to being humiliated, and what happened next nearly cost us everything." But that the old man thought as he watched his wife climb the porch steps was a story for tomorrow. 1919 Red Canyon Ranch. Naomi reached the porch and set down her basket of vegetables, her eyes moving between Jacob and their grandson with the knowing look of a woman who'd heard her husband tell stories before. "You're filling the boy's head with old troubles," she said, but there was warmth in her voice. "He asked," Jacob replied. "He always asks, and you never can resist." She touched Jacob's shoulder as she passed her hand, lingering just a moment. Even after 20 years of marriage, those small touches still meant something. The grandson watched his grandmother disappear into the house, then turned back to Jacob. "You said Mallory tried to take the ranch. How—" Jacob settled deeper into his chair, his mind drifting back to that autumn day when everything had changed. First, you need to understand what Copper Springs was like in 1899. Small town, maybe 200 people growing because everyone thought the railroad was coming through, and wherever the railroad goes, land values follow. Men like Curtis Mallory knew that. They were buying up property cheap, waiting to sell high once the tracks got laid. And he wanted your land. He wanted Red Canyon more than anything. The ranch sits right in the natural corridor through the mountains. Perfect route for a railroad. But I'd owned it for 22 years. Built it with Margaret. Buried her there. Wasn't about to sell to anyone, especially not to a man like Mallory. The old man's jaw tightened. But when Naomi showed up, Mallory saw his chance. Not just to get the land, but to make it legal. Make it look like he was protecting the town instead of just being greedy. September 1899. The road to Copper Springs. The morning Jacob and Naomi rode into town, the sky was clear and sharp, the kind of autumn day that made you forget winter was coming. Jacob had debated taking Naomi at all, knowing what the response would be, but she'd needed to come. She'd made that clear. "I won't hide," she'd said that morning, braiding her long black hair with red thread. "I've hidden enough in my life. If this is going to be my home, people need to see me, see that I'm not afraid." Jacob had wanted to argue, but the set of her jaw reminded him too much of Margaret for the words to come out. So instead, he'd saddled both horses, checked his Winchester rifle, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. The ride took 2 hours. They didn't talk much. Jacob spent most of it watching Naomi from the corner of his eye, noting the way she sat her horse, the confident way she moved. 20 years had changed the terrified child he'd pulled from the flood into a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. It made what was about to happen even harder to watch. Copper Springs appeared as a dark line against the desert, a single street of weathered buildings that had seen better days and didn't expect to see them again. The general store stood at one end, Elena Torres's domain. The saloon, the Silver Dollar, anchored the other end, and that was Mallory's territory. In between lay the church, the sheriff's office, the land office, and the blacksmith shop where Samuel Ironwood's cousin worked. A town trying to be more than it was, waiting for a railroad that might never come. Jacob felt eyes turn toward them the moment they rode onto Main Street. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People stepped out of doorways to stare. A woman actually pulled her child back inside like Apache heritage was something you could catch. "Steady," Jacob murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Naomi or himself. They hitched their horses in front of Elena's store. Jacob helped Naomi down, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing down from every direction. Inside the store, Elena Torres looked up from her ledger. She was a handsome woman in her early 40s, a widow who'd run the store alone since her husband died of fever 3 years back. Jacob had always liked her. She was fair, didn't gossip more than necessary, and treated everyone the same, whether they were white Mexican or Apache. "Jacob," she said, her voice neutral. Then her eyes moved to Naomi. "Ma'am?" "Mrs. Torres," Jacob said. "This is Miss Naomi Whitefeather. She's staying at Red Canyon for a while." Elena's eyebrow rose slightly, but she just nodded. "What can I help you with today?" Jacob ran through his list. Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, pork ammunition for his Winchester and his Colt. Elena tallied everything up with practiced efficiency. $4.75, she said. Jacob counted out the money from his worn leather purse. As he did, he was aware of people gathering outside the store's front window. Word traveled fast in a small town. By now, everyone knew the hermit of Red Canyon had brought an Apache woman to town. Elena noticed, too. As she wrapped the purchases in brown paper, she spoke quietly. "Jacob, you might want to finish up here and head back. Curtis Mallory's been in the saloon since noon, and he's got Vernon Blake with him." Vernon Blake was Mallory's lawyer, brought in from back east somewhere. Smart, educated, and completely without conscience when it came to serving his client's interests. "Thanks for the warning," Jacob said. "I'm not warning you," Helena said, meeting his eyes. "I'm just telling you what is." Jacob appreciated the distinction. He gathered the packages and turned to leave Naomi beside him. They'd almost made it to the door when it swung open and Curtis Mallory walked in. Mallory was 40 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in an Eastern suit that cost more than most men in Copper Springs made in a year. His face was flushed, whether from drink or anger or both. Jacob couldn't tell. "Well, well," Mallory said, his voice carrying that particular loudness drunk men got when they thought they were being clever. "Jacob Hartwell. Haven't seen you in town in months. Thought maybe you'd died out there and the coyotes had eaten you." "I'm fine, Curtis. Just came for supplies." Mallory's eyes slid to Naomi, and something ugly crossed his face. "I see you brought company. That your new squaw Hartwell following in your dead wife's footsteps?" The word squaw hit the air like a slap. It was an insult, deliberate and cutting, meant to reduce Naomi to something less than human. Jacob felt his hands tighten on the packages he was holding. "Her name is Miss Whitefeather," he said, his voice level but hard. "And you'll speak to her with respect, or you won't speak at all." Mallory laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Respect for an Indian, Hartwell. You've been alone too long. It's addled your brain. First that half-breed wife of yours, now this. Man starts to wonder about your judgment." Jacob set the packages down carefully on the counter. When he turned back to Mallory, something in his expression made the bigger man take a half-step back. "You can come for me all you want, Curtis. But you mention my wife again, you mention Miss Whitefeather with anything but respect, and I'll make you regret it." "That a threat?" "It's a promise." Mallory's face darkened. Behind him, Vernon Blake appeared in the doorway, a thin man with wire spectacles and the calculating eyes of someone always looking for an angle. Vernon Blake stepped forward, his voice smooth as oil. "Mr. Hartwell, we've been reviewing your property records. There are irregularities." Jacob went very still. Blake continued, "Your deed was filed jointly with your wife in 1877. When she died in 1884, it should have been re-registered. It wasn't. Legally, the title is in question." "That's a lie," Jacob said flatly. "It's the law," Blake corrected. And Mr. Mallory, being a concerned citizen and landowner, felt it was his duty to bring this to the attention of the territorial authorities. Of course, these legal matters can be expensive and time-consuming. Mr. Mallory might be willing to purchase the property from you at fair market value, say $500. That's generous for disputed land. $500. Red Canyon Ranch was worth at least $5,000, probably more if the railroad came through, and Mallory knew it. Jacob looked at the lawyer, then at Mallory, understanding exactly what was happening. This wasn't about legal irregularities. This was about finding a way to steal his land while making it look legitimate. "Tell Mallory he can go to hell," Jacob said. "That land's mine, has been for 22 years, will be until I die." "That can be arranged," Mallory said, and this time there was no mistaking the threat. The store had gone completely silent. Helena stood behind her counter, her face pale. Outside, a crowd had gathered, drawn by raised voices. "I think it's time we left," Naomi said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since entering the store. Jacob wanted to argue, wanted to plant his feet and make Mallory back down, but he saw the wisdom in Naomi's words. This wasn't the place for this fight. He picked up his packages and turned toward the door. Mallory stepped aside, but not before muttering just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Enjoy your Indian whore while you can, Hartwell. You won't have that land much longer, and without the land she'll move on to the next fool willing to take her in." Jacob didn't think. His fist connected with Mallory's jaw before the words had finished leaving the man's mouth. The packages hit the floor. Mallory staggered backward into a shelf, sending canned goods clattering across the wooden boards. For a moment, everything froze. Then Mallory lunged forward, and suddenly they were fighting, really fighting, fists and elbows and the grunting rage of two men who'd hated each other for years and finally had an excuse. Jacob was older but harder. Mallory was bigger but slower. They crashed through the store, knocking over displays while Elena shouted for them to stop, and Naomi stood very still, watching with eyes that had seen violence before and knew better than to get between fighting men. It ended when Sheriff Henry Cole burst through the door, his own Colt drawn, and fired a shot into the ceiling. "That's enough." Both men froze, breathing hard, bleeding from split lips and scraped knuckles. Cole was a weathered man in his 50s, practical and cautious. The kind of lawman who'd learned that keeping the peace sometimes meant letting things slide, and sometimes meant coming down hard. "Jacob, step back," Cole ordered. "Curtis, you stay right where you are." Jacob stepped back, his chest heaving. His right hand was already swelling, probably broken something. "He assaulted me." Mallory spat blood onto the floor. "You all saw it. I want him arrested." "I saw you provoke him," Elena said from behind the counter. "Said some things no man should say about a woman." "I don't care what he said," Cole replied. "Jacob, you know better. You can't just hit a man in my town because he runs his mouth." "Then tell him to keep his mouth shut about things that don't concern him." Cole sighed, holstering his weapon. "I'll let this go once, Jacob, once. You assault a citizen again, and I'll lock you up. You understand?" Jacob nodded stiffly. Cole turned to Mallory. "Curtis, maybe you should think before you speak. Words have consequences." "This isn't over," Mallory said, wiping blood from his mouth with an expensive handkerchief. "Not by a long shot." Blake stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. "Sheriff, if you would be so kind as to serve this, Mr. Hartwell is being officially notified of a title dispute. He has 30 days to prove clear ownership of Red Canyon Ranch or vacate the property." He held out the paper. Cole took it, reluctantly glanced at the legal language, and handed it to Jacob. "I'm sorry, Jacob. It's official court business. I have to serve it." Jacob took the paper, not bothering to read it. He knew what it said, knew what it meant. They were coming for his land, and they were using the law to do it. He looked at Naomi, who'd stood silent through all of it, her face calm despite the chaos around her. "Let's go," he said. They gathered the scattered packages in silence. No one helped. No one spoke. The crowd outside parted to let them through, faces curious and judging and afraid all at once. Jacob and Naomi rode out of Copper Springs with the weight of every eye in town on their backs. They were halfway home before either spoke. "I'm sorry," Jacob said finally. "I shouldn't have hit him. He deserved it. Maybe. But it gave him what he wanted. Made me look like I can't control my temper, made it easier for him to paint me as the problem." Naomi was quiet for a moment, her paint mare keeping easy pace with Jacob's gelding. "He called me a whore," she said, her voice level but with steel underneath. "And he insulted your wife's memory. You think any man in that town would have done different, some might have walked away. And you're not some men, you're Jacob Hartwell, the man who jumped into a flood to save a drowning child, the man who's kept his land for 22 years through drought and disease and loneliness. You don't walk away from things that matter." Jacob looked at her, surprised. "How do you know that about me? You've known me less than a week." Naomi smiled, small and sad. "I've known you for 20 years, maybe not in person, but in here." She touched her chest. "When you know someone's truest self, the rest is just details." They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence, companionable, understanding. When they reached Red Canyon Ranch, Samuel Ironwood was waiting on the porch. He stood as they approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard there was trouble in town," Samuel said. "Whole territory will know by nightfall. You all right?" "Been better," Jacob admitted, dismounting and wincing as his injured hand protested. Samuel's eyes moved to Naomi. "And you must be the woman everyone's talking about." "I must be," Naomi said, swinging down from her horse. "I'm Naomi Whitefeather. Samuel Ironwood. I helped Jacob search for your family after the flood. You probably don't remember me." "I remember," Naomi said. "You found my parents' bodies. You treated them with respect. I remember that." Samuel nodded slowly, something passing between them that didn't need words. "Mallory's going after the land," Jacob said, tying his horse to the rail. "Got his lawyer claiming the title's invalid. Is it? How the hell should I know? I filed the deed in 1877. Margaret and I both signed it. When she died, I didn't think I needed to refile. Nobody said anything about it for 15 years. Until now," Samuel said. "Until Mallory decided he wanted it bad enough to manufacture a legal case." That about sums it up. The three of them moved to the porch, sitting in the chairs Jacob had carved from pine years ago. The sun was getting low, painting the cottonwood tree in shades of gold. "What are you going to do?" Samuel asked. Jacob pulled out the legal notice Blake had given him, unfolding it with his good hand. The language was dense, full of whereas and heretofore, and other words designed to confuse more than clarify. But the meaning was clear enough: 30 days to prove ownership or get out. "Fight," Jacob said simply. "It's my land. I built it. I'm not giving it up because some lawyer found a loophole." "Fighting means court," Samuel said. "Means lawyers of your own. Means money you probably don't have." "Then I'll figure something out." Naomi spoke up for the first time since they'd sat down. "You said Margaret's family was Apache, her grandmother." Jacob nodded. "Dawn Walker. She gave us the land, blessed the marriage. It was all done proper according to Apache custom." "But not according to white man's law," Naomi said, understanding the problem immediately. "Apache land transfers aren't recognized in territorial court." Which is exactly what Mallory's counting on. The very thing that makes this land special, that ties it to Margaret's heritage, is what makes the title vulnerable. Naomi stood walking to the edge of the porch, looking out at the land stretching before them in the fading light. "We need witnesses," she said. "People who were there when the land was transferred, people who can testify to the legitimacy of the claim." "That was 22 years ago," Jacob said. "Most of those people are dead or scattered." "Not all of them. Margaret's Aunt Sarah. Is she still alive?" Jacob sat up straighter. He hadn't thought of Sarah in years. She'd been at the wedding, he remembered that. She'd stood with Margaret's grandmother when the blessing was given. "Last I heard, she was on the White Mountain Reservation, but that was years ago. She'd be close to 70 by now if she's still living." "Then I'll find her," Naomi said. "I speak the language. I know the reservations. If she's alive, I can find her." "That's 150 miles through rough country," Jacob protested. Naomi turned to face him, and in the dying light, Jacob saw the determination that had kept her searching for him for 20 years. "I've traveled farther, and I won't let them take this land, not when I just found my way home." 1919. The porch. The old man paused in his telling, reaching for his cup only to find it empty. The sun had set while he talked, and the first stars were beginning to show in the darkening sky. His grandson sat silent, processing the story. "She went alone," the boy finally asked, "into Apache territory." "Not alone," Jacob said. "Samuel went with her, said his cousin lived near White Mountain, that he could help guide them, and they had 10 days to get there and back before the court date." "Did they make it?" Jacob smiled, looking toward the door where he could hear Naomi moving around inside preparing supper. "They made it." But what happened on that journey, what Naomi found at White Mountain, that changed everything. Not just the court case, everything. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after sitting so long. "That's enough storytelling for today. Your grandmother will want us washed up for supper. But you can't stop there. Can and will. Some stories need to breathe between tellings. Give your mind time to understand what it's hearing." The boy groaned but stood as well, knowing better than to argue when his grandfather used that particular tone. Inside, Naomi had set the table, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the cabin. She looked up as they entered, her eyes finding Jacob's across the room. And even after 20 years, something passed between them that the boy was too young to fully understand. Love, yes, but also recognition. Two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and refused to let go. As they sat down to eat, the boy couldn't help asking one more question. "Grandfather, What did you do while grandmother was gone? Just wait. Jacob exchanged a look with Naomi, and something dark flickered across his face. No, he said quietly. I didn't just wait. Because 3 days after they left, Curtis Mallory made his next move. And it involved fire. 1919 Red Canyon Ranch, evening supper, passed in relative quiet the way meals did in families where words didn't need to fill every silence. The boy ate quickly, his mind clearly still on the story, glancing between his grandparents with barely contained impatience. Naomi caught Jacob's eye across the table and shook her head slightly, a small smile playing at her lips. They'd raised 3 children together. They knew when a young mind was too full of questions to let rest. After the dishes were cleared and washed, they returned to the porch. The night had turned cool the way desert nights did when autumn settled in. Jacob lit his pipe, the tobacco glowing orange in the darkness. "The fire," the boy prompted. "You said there was a fire." Jacob drew on his pipe, letting the smoke curl up into the night air. 3 days after Naomi and Samuel left for White Mountain, I woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. September 1899. Red Canyon Ranch. Jacob's eyes opened in darkness. For a moment he wasn't sure what had woken him. Then his nose caught it. Smoke. Not the familiar scent of a banked hearth fire, but something sharper, angrier, wrong. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before his mind fully caught up with his body. Through the window, he could see an orange glow coming from the direction of the south barn. Fire. Jacob grabbed his Winchester and ran outside in his undershirt and hastily pulled on trousers. The south barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching 30 feet into the black sky, sparks swirling up like angry fireflies. Inside that barn was his winter hay, his spare tack, and 2 of his older horses that he'd separated from the main herd because of injuries. The horses. Jacob sprinted toward the barn, the heat hitting him like a wall when he got within 50 feet. He could hear the animals inside screaming in a way horses do when they know they're going to die. The sound cut through him worse than any blade. The main doors were blocked by flame. Jacob ran around to the side entrance, a smaller door he used for feeding. The wood was hot to the touch, but not yet burning. He kicked it in smoke, billowing out so thick he couldn't see 3 feet in front of him. He dropped low where the air was clearer and crawled inside, calling to the horses. One of them, a gray mare named Silver, answered with a terrified whinny. Jacob followed the sound, found her stall, got the gate open. The horse nearly trampled him, getting out, her eyes rolling white with fear. The second horse, an old bay gelding that had been his father's, was down. Jacob could see him through the smoke on his side, not moving. Dead already, whether from smoke or heart failure or pure terror, Jacob couldn't tell. He backed out of the barn as a section of roof collapsed behind him, sending up a shower of sparks that burned holes in his shirt. Silver had run clear, disappearing into the night. At least she was safe. Jacob stumbled away from the burning barn, coughing hard enough to taste blood. That's when he saw the second fire, starting at the north fence line, small flames licking at the posts where someone had piled brush and doused it with what smelled like kerosene. Not an accident. Not lightning. Arson. Jacob ran for the well, grabbed the bucket, started hauling water. It was futile, and he knew it. One man with 1 bucket against 2 fires, but he had to try. This was his land, his life, everything he'd built with Margaret. He didn't know how long he fought it. Time became meaningless, just the endless cycle of bucket to well, to fire the heat and the smoke, and the growing certainty that he was going to lose everything. Then he heard horses, multiple horses coming fast up the trail. For a moment, Jacob's hand went to his rifle propped against the well. If Mallory had come to watch him burn, if he'd brought men to finish the job, Jacob would sell his life dearly. But the riders who emerged from the darkness weren't Mallory's men. Samuel Ironwood was in the lead, and behind him came 4 other men from neighboring ranches, all carrying buckets and shovels and grim determination. "Saw the glow from 5 miles out," Samuel said, swinging down from his horse. "Figured you could use help." Jacob wanted to thank him, but couldn't find words through the smoke burning his throat. Instead, he just nodded and went back to fighting the fire. With 6 men working, they managed to save the north fence and keep the fire from spreading to the main barn where the rest of the horses were stabled. But the south barn burned to the ground, nothing left but smoking timbers and ash by the time the sun came up. Jacob stood looking at the ruins, his hands blistered, his face blackened with soot, his clothes burned through in a dozen places. The old bay was dead. 3 tons of winter hay was gone. The barn itself, which he and Margaret had built together in their first year, was destroyed. Samuel walked up beside him, equally smoke-stained and exhausted. "Kerosene," Samuel said quietly. "I found the cans they used. 3 of them hidden in the brush past the fence line, not even trying to hide it well." "Mallory," Jacob said, his voice raw. "Probably, but you'll never prove it. Men like him don't get their own hands dirty." Sheriff Henry Cole arrived an hour later, brought by one of the neighboring ranchers who'd ridden to town to report the fire. Cole examined the scene with tired eyes, picked up one of the kerosene cans and sighed. "This is bad, Jacob. You think, it's bad because I know what it means and I can't do a damn thing about it. These cans could have come from anywhere. Could have been kids playing with fire. Could have been someone with a grudge. Unless you saw who did it, unless you can prove it, my hands are tied." "Your hands have been tied since the day Mallory started pouring money into this county," Jacob said bitterly. Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "I'll file a report, for whatever good that does. But Jacob, listen to me. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Men like Mallory, when they want something, they don't stop. And they don't fight fair." "Neither do I," Jacob said. "Not anymore." Cole left, and the neighboring ranchers drifted away one by one, offering condolences and promises of help that Jacob knew they meant but probably couldn't deliver. Not if it meant crossing Mallory. Only Samuel remained, helping Jacob sort through the debris, seeing what could be salvaged. "Where's Naomi?" Samuel asked. "On the trail to White Mountain with your cousin. Remember, looking for Margaret's Aunt Sarah." Samuel looked up sharply. "I sent my cousin with her. I'm here." Jacob felt his stomach drop. "You're here. Then who's with Naomi?" "Nobody. I told her I'd catch up in a day or 2 after I helped you prepare some defenses. She said she knew the way, that she'd traveled that country before." "Samuel, she's alone out there. If Mallory knows she's gone, if he wants to stop her from finding witnesses—" The 2 men looked at each other, the same terrible thought occurring to both of them simultaneously. "I'll go," Samuel said. "I'll ride now, catch up to her." "Take my best horse," Jacob said, "and Samuel, if anything happens to her—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Samuel was mounted and gone within 10 minutes, pushing hard toward the northeast, where the trail to White Mountain cut through rough country that could hide 100 men with ill intent. Jacob stood alone in his burned-out ranch, covered in soot and blood and failure, and for the first time in 15 years, he prayed. Not to God exactly. He'd lost most of his faith when Margaret died. But to something. To the land itself, maybe. To whatever force in the universe had brought Naomi back to him after 20 years. Keep her safe, he thought. Please just keep her safe. The trail to White Mountain, 3 days earlier. Naomi had left Red Canyon Ranch at dawn with a bedroll, enough food for a week, ammunition for her Spencer carbine, and a determination that surprised even her. She'd traveled alone before plenty of times. The years after her grandmother died had taught her self-sufficiency, if nothing else. But this felt different. This wasn't just surviving. This was fighting for something. For a place, for a future, for Jacob. The thought of him made her smile as her paint mare picked her way through the rocky terrain. Jacob Hartwell, 45 years old, gray in his beard, with eyes that had seen too much loss, and a heart he kept locked up tight because he was afraid of losing again. She'd known within a day of arriving at Red Canyon that she loved him, not the grateful love of a child for her rescuer. Real love, adult love, the kind that looked at a person's flaws and scars and said yes anyway. Whether Jacob loved her back, she wasn't entirely sure, but she'd seen the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She'd felt the hesitation in his hands when they accidentally touched. He was afraid. Well, she could be patient. She'd waited 20 years to find him. She could wait a little longer for him to find himself. The trail wound through country that grew more rugged as she traveled northeast. Red rock canyons gave way to pine forests, and the air turned cooler. She saw deer, a family of javelinas, and once in the distance a small herd of wild horses that made her think of the stories her grandmother had told about the old days before the reservations, when Apache people had moved freely across this land. On the second day, she noticed the riders. 2 of them staying about a mile back, just visible when the trail crested rises. They weren't trying very hard to hide, which meant either they were incompetent or they wanted her to know they were there. Naomi considered her options. She could try to lose them, but that would slow her down, and she was already cutting it close on time. She could confront them, but 2 against 1 in open country wasn't odds she liked. Or she could keep going and stay alert, trusting her skills and her mare's speed if things went bad. She chose the third option. By evening of the second day, the riders had closed the distance to half a mile. Naomi made camp in a spot she'd chosen carefully, a small clearing with good sight lines, and her back to a rock face that couldn't be approached quietly. She built a fire, made coffee, and cleaned her carbine with deliberate care, making sure anyone watching could see she was armed and knew how to use it. The riders didn't approach that night, but she could see their fire in the distance, an orange glow against the dark hillside. Naomi didn't sleep. She sat with her back to the rock, her carbine across her lap, listening to the night sounds and thinking about her mother, about the fire that had killed her, about the men who'd set it claiming the Apache had stolen cattle they'd never touched. Fire was always the weapon of cowards. Men who attacked in the dark, who hurt from a distance, who never had to look their victims in the eye. If these men following her thought she'd be easy prey because she was a woman, because she was Apache, because she was alone, they were about to learn differently. Dawn came cold and gray. Naomi broke camp, quickly mounted her mare, and continued northeast. The riders followed. Around mid-morning the trail narrowed, passing through a canyon with high walls on either side. It was a perfect place for an ambush, which is exactly why Naomi had been watching for it. When she heard the rocks shift above her, she was already moving, kicking her mare into a run as a rifle shot cracked through the canyon. The bullet spanged off stone behind her, sending chips flying. 2 more shots, both missing, as Naomi's mare stretched out into a full gallop. The canyon was a quarter-mile long. If she could make it through, she'd have open ground again, room to maneuver. A rider appeared ahead of her, blocking the trail, rifle raised. Naomi didn't slow down. Instead, she pulled her own carbine and fired from horseback, a difficult shot that went wide but made the man flinch and pull his horse aside. She thundered past him, bent low over her mare's neck, hearing him curse and wheel his horse to follow. Behind her, the other rider was coming down from his position on the canyon wall. 2 men, both armed, both after her. She had maybe a 2-minute lead. Naomi burst out of the canyon into scrubland, her mare's hooves drumming hard against packed earth. Up ahead she could see a stand of pines that might offer cover. She angled toward them, hearing the pursuit behind her getting closer. A shot. Her mare stumbled, recovered, but Naomi felt the animal's stride change. Not hit, but tiring. They'd been running hard for days. The mare was giving everything she had, but it might not be enough. Naomi made a decision. She couldn't outrun them, so she'd have to outsmart them. She steered into the pines, let the trees hide her for a moment, then swung down from her mare, grabbed her carbine and what ammunition she could carry, and slapped the horse's flank, sending it running deeper into the trees without her. The pursuing riders would follow the horse, and she would be waiting. Naomi found a position behind a fallen log, her carbine resting on the rough bark, sighted and ready. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. This was survival. This was what her grandmother had trained her for in the years after the flood. The first rider came crashing through the brush on horseback, following her mare's tracks. Naomi let him pass waiting. The second rider was more cautious, coming slower, his rifle up and ready. When he was 20 feet away, Naomi spoke. "That's far enough." The man jerked his horse to a stop, his rifle swinging toward her voice, but he was still mounted, still moving, still off balance. Naomi had the advantage. "Drop the rifle," she said. "Do it now." Instead, the man fired. The shot went wild, nowhere near her. Naomi fired back, aiming low, hitting the man's horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed and went down, throwing its rider hard. The first rider had heard the shots and was coming back. Naomi shifted her aim, firing twice more, both shots deliberate misses meant to scare rather than kill. The rider pulled up short, suddenly realizing he was riding into a prepared position against someone who could shoot. "Your friend is down," Naomi called out. "You want to join him? Keep coming. You want to walk away? Turn around now." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the mounted rider backed his horse, turned and rode hard the way he'd come. Naomi waited, her carbine still ready, until she was sure he wasn't coming back. Then she moved carefully toward the downed rider. He was on his hands and knees, dazed from the fall, his rifle 10 feet away. "Who sent you?" Naomi asked, her carbine pointed at his chest. The man looked up at her, his face bloody from hitting the ground. He was young, maybe 25, with the hard eyes of someone who'd done this kind of work before. "Nobody sent us," he muttered. "Try again." "Just saw a lone woman on the trail. Thought we'd have some fun." Naomi's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last chance. Who sent you?" The man's eyes flickered fear, breaking through the bravado. "Mallory. Curtis Mallory. Said there was a woman heading to White Mountain trying to find witnesses for some court case. Said to make sure she didn't get there. We weren't supposed to kill you, just delay you, scare you back. You failed." Naomi stepped back, keeping her carbine trained on him. "Your horse is injured. You'll have to walk back to wherever you came from. Tell Mallory that Naomi Whitefeather doesn't scare. Tell him if he sends men after me again, I won't miss next time." She backed away, whistled for her mare, and when the horse emerged from the trees, mounted quickly and rode on, leaving the man sitting in the dirt. 1919, the porch. "She shot his horse," the grandson asked, eyes wide. Naomi's voice came from the doorway. She'd been listening from inside, and now she stepped out onto the porch, a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. "I shot under the horse," she corrected. "Grazed the shoulder, enough to bring it down without crippling it. The animal recovered fine." And the men walked back to Copper Springs with a story about the dangerous Apache woman who'd ambushed them. Made me sound like some kind of devil. She smiled, which suited me just fine. The boy looked at his grandmother with new eyes, seeing past the woman who baked bread and tended gardens to the person who'd survived alone in hard country, who'd fought off ambushes, who'd traveled 150 miles to save a man's land claim. "Did you find her?" he asked. Margaret's Aunt Sarah, Naomi and Jacob exchanged a look. "I did," Naomi said softly, "and what she told me changed everything." 1919, Red Canyon Ranch, night. Naomi settled into the chair beside Jacob, her hand finding his in the darkness. Even after 20 years, the memory of that journey still carried weight. Sarah was living on the White Mountain Reservation. Naomi began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "It took me 2 more days to reach it after the ambush. The reservation was nothing like I remembered from my childhood. Smaller, poorer. The government had moved the boundaries again, taken more land, pushed people into less space." The boy leaned forward, listening. "I found Sarah in a small cabin at the edge of the settlement. She was 68 years old, nearly blind from cataracts, but her mind was sharp as a blade. When I told her who I was, who had sent me, she started to cry." September 1899, White Mountain Reservation. The cabin was simple. One room, dirt floor, a hearth in the corner where a small fire burned. Sarah Wakinian sat on a blanket near the fire, her weathered hands working at a piece of beadwork she couldn't see well enough to finish, but continued anyway, muscle memory guiding her fingers. When Naomi knocked on the doorframe, the old woman's head lifted. "Who comes?" she asked in Apache. "My name is Naomi Whitefeather," Naomi replied in the same language. "I come seeking Sarah Wakinian, aunt to Margaret Hartwell." The old woman's hands stopped moving. For a long moment she was completely still. Then tears began to roll down her weathered cheeks. "Margaret," she whispered, "you bring news of Margaret." Naomi stepped inside, kneeling beside the old woman. "Margaret passed 15 years ago. I'm sorry. But her husband, Jacob Hartwell, still lives. He keeps the land, honors her memory, and he needs your help." Sarah reached out with trembling fingers, touching Naomi's face the way blind people do, reading features through touch. "You are not white," she said. "No, I am Apache. Jacob saved my life when I was a child. Now I help him save what he and Margaret built together." "Tell me," Sarah said, and so Naomi told her everything. The flood 20 years ago, her return to Red Canyon Mallory's legal challenge, the claim that the land title was invalid because it passed through Apache hands. When Naomi finished, Sarah sat in silence for so long that Naomi wondered if she'd fallen asleep. Then the old woman stood with surprising strength and went to a wooden box in the corner of the cabin. "My mother was Dawn Walker," Sarah said, opening the box with careful hands. "She was medicine woman for our people. She owned land before the white man's government said we could not own land. She owned it because she was born on it, because her mother was born on it, because the earth knew her blood." Sarah pulled something from the box wrapped in soft deerskin. "When Margaret came to us, when she told us she wanted to marry the white man Jacob Hartwell, my mother was angry. She said Margaret was turning her back on her people. But then she met Jacob. He came to our camp, showed respect, learned our ways. He asked permission proper not from Margaret's father, who was already dead, but from my mother, who was the eldest, who held the right." Sarah unwrapped the deerskin, revealing a piece of paper yellowed with age, but carefully preserved. "My mother gave them the land as marriage gift, and she did it in both ways, the white man's way and our way." She held out the paper to Naomi. It was a deed, handwritten in careful script dated August 1877. The language was formal legal, describing the boundaries of Red Canyon Ranch, the water rights, the mineral rights, all the particulars that white man's law required. At the bottom were 4 signatures. Dawn Walker, her name written in English with an X beside it, and her mark in Apache symbols. Margaret Hartwell signed in elegant script. Jacob Hartwell signed in a rougher hand. And 2 witnesses, Samuel Ironwood and Reverend Thomas Grain. But what made Naomi's breath catch was what was written at the top of the deed in Apache symbols that she could barely read but recognized as sacred. "What does it say?" Naomi asked, pointing to the symbols. Sarah's blind eyes seemed to look right through her. "It says, 'This land is blessed by Dawn Walker, medicine woman of the White Mountain people. It is given in love to her granddaughter Margaret and to Jacob Hartwell, who showed honor. The earth knows their blood now. The earth will remember.'" Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. This wasn't just a legal document. This was a covenant between people and land, witnessed by both laws, both worlds. "This is what Jacob needs," Naomi said. "This proves the title is legitimate." "This proves more than title," Sarah said. "This proves that my mother saw something in Jacob Hartwell, that she blessed the joining of white and Apache blood on that land, that she meant for it to be a bridge between worlds." The old woman reached out and gripped Naomi's hand with surprising strength. "There is more. My mother had visions in her last days. She saw things that had not yet happened." "What did she see?" Sarah pulled Naomi closer, her voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing sacred secrets. "She saw a white mountain girl standing with a white man on red earth. She saw them fight together against those who would divide them. She saw children, many children, mixing the blood further until the lines between peoples blurred and disappeared. And she said this was good. She said this was how we survive, not by staying separate, but by loving strong enough to build bridges. Naomi felt tears on her own cheeks now. Did she say when? Did she see who? Sarah smiled her blind eyes, somehow finding Naomi's face. She said the girl would come twice, once as a child to be saved, once as a woman to do the saving. She said the man would know her by her courage and by the promise she kept. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Outside wind whispered through the pines, but inside time itself seemed to pause. "You," Naomi whispered. "You," Sarah confirmed. "My mother saw you 60 years ago before you were born, before your mother was born. She saw Jacob pull you from water. She saw you return to him across 20 years of searching. She saw you stand beside him when others would not." Naomi's mind was reeling. She'd come seeking a legal document, a piece of paper to wave in court. Instead, she'd found something far more profound, a prophecy, a blessing that reached across generations. "Will you come?" Naomi asked. "Will you testify in court, tell the judge what your mother intended?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her weathered face thoughtful. "I am old, nearly blind. The journey is hard. I know, but Jacob needs you. The land needs you to speak for it." "There are others," Sarah said. 15 elders who remember my mother, who witnessed the blessing, who know the old ways. If I go, they will go, but we will need help, protection. The white man's law does not always honor Apache testimony." "We'll find a way," Naomi promised, though she didn't know how. Sarah nodded slowly. "Then I will come, for my mother's vision, for Margaret's memory, for the land that knows our blood." The return journey. Naomi left White Mountain Reservation 3 days later, with Sarah riding beside her on a gentle mare and 15 Apache elders following in a wagon driven by Samuel Ironwood, who had arrived the day after Naomi, pushing his horse hard after learning about the ambush. "Jacob's been half out of his mind with worry," Samuel told her. "Ranch was burned. South barn's gone. He thinks Mallory's going to kill you to stop you from bringing back witnesses." "Mallory tried," Naomi said simply. "He failed." She told Samuel about the ambush, about shooting the man's horse, about sending him back with a message. Samuel listened with a grim smile. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish." "Maybe both." The journey back took 6 days instead of 4 because of the wagon and the elders' age. They traveled carefully, watching for signs of pursuit. But none came. Either Mallory's men had given up, or they were waiting for a better opportunity. On the 5th day, they were joined by an unexpected companion. A cavalry scout rode up to their camp at evening, young and lean, with the bearing of a soldier. He wore the blue uniform of the U.S. Army, with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. "I'm looking for Naomi Whitefeather," he said, his voice carrying a familiar accent that made Naomi's heart stop. She stepped forward and the young man's eyes widened. "Naomi, is that really you?" "Thomas," she breathed. Her brother swung down from his horse, and for a moment they just stared at each other across 8 years of silence and anger and pain. Thomas was 24 now, no longer the angry boy who'd blamed her for their mother's death. His face had hardened, aged by service and war. He'd been in Cuba, she knew, fighting in the Spanish-American War that had ended the year before. "What are you doing here?" Naomi asked. "Samuel's cousin sent word, said you were in trouble traveling alone to White Mountain. I was stationed at Fort Apache. Got leave to come find you." "To protect me. To stop you," Thomas said quietly. "I came to bring you back to the reservation. Thought you were being foolish getting involved in white man's fights over land that should have been ours to begin with." And now, Thomas looked at the elders sitting around the fire, at Sarah, with her blind eyes and strong spirit, at the deed wrapped carefully in deerskin. "Now, I'm not sure what I think. Tell me what's happening. All of it." So Naomi told him About Jacob, about Red Canyon, about Mallory's legal challenge, and the fire and the ambush, about Dawn Walker's vision and Sarah's testimony, about coming home. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You love him," he said finally. "This Jacob Hartwell." "Yes." "And you think you can win against a man like Mallory who has money and lawyers and half the territory in his pocket? I think we have to try." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "I blamed you," he said abruptly, "for Mother, for the fire, for not saving her. I know. I was wrong. I was a child and I was angry and I needed someone to blame, but I was wrong." Naomi felt her throat tighten. "I blamed myself too. I know. I see it now. The way you've spent your whole life trying to save others, trying to make up for one death you couldn't prevent when you were 8 years old." Thomas stepped closer. "But you don't owe the world a debt, Naomi. You don't owe anyone, not even Jacob Hartwell. I know that now. This isn't about debt, it's about choice, about choosing where I belong." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then I'll help you. Not because you need protection, but because you're my sister, and I've wasted 8 years being angry when I should have been proud." "Proud? You survived, Naomi. Everything we went through, everything we lost, and you survived with your spirit intact, with your ability to love intact. That takes more courage than anything I did in Cuba." Naomi reached out and took her brother's hand, and for the first time in 8 years, they were family again. 1919. The porch. "Uncle Thomas came back?" the boy asked. He'd met his great-uncle, of course, but had never heard this part of the story. "He did," Naomi said. "And he used his military authority to requisition official transport for the elders to get us through checkpoints that might have stopped a group of Apache travelers. He made the journey possible." "We got back to Red Canyon with 2 days to spare before the court date," Jacob added. "I was standing on the porch when I saw them coming. A wagon full of elders, Samuel driving Naomi, riding beside a cavalry scout I didn't recognize at first. Thought I was seeing visions." "What did you do?" Jacob smiled. "I ran down to meet them like a fool. Grabbed Naomi off her horse before she'd even stopped, held her so tight she couldn't breathe. Thought I'd lost her. Thought Mallory's men had killed her, or worse. I told him I was fine," Naomi said, her hand tightening on Jacob's. "Told him about the ambush, about Sarah, about the deed, and I watched his face when he understood what we'd found." "What did he say?" "He didn't say anything," Naomi replied. "He kissed me, right there in front of Samuel and Thomas and 15 Apache elders and God and everybody. First time he'd kissed me. First time he'd shown what he felt. And that's when you knew you'd win," Jacob shook his head. "That's when I knew that even if we lost, even if Mallory took the land, I'd already won the only thing that mattered. But we still had to go to court, still had to face Mallory and his lawyers, and a system designed to erase people like Naomi and Sarah and everyone who came with us." The old man stood slowly, his joints protesting. "That trial, what happened in that courtroom in Santa Fe, that's the story for tomorrow. Right now I need sleep. So do you." The boy groaned but knew better than to argue. As he headed inside, Jacob and Naomi remained on the porch, looking out at the cottonwood tree barely visible in the starlight. "Do you ever think about it?" Naomi asked quietly. "What Sarah said about Dawn Walker's vision, all the time. Do you believe it? That she really saw us?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering. "I believe that sometimes the land speaks to those who listen. I believe your great-great-grandmother was one of those people. Whether she saw the future or just understood what was possible, I don't know. But she was right. We did build a bridge, and our children, our grandchildren, they're walking across it." Naomi leaned her head on his shoulder. "Tomorrow you'll tell him about the trial." "Tomorrow," Jacob agreed. "About how we stood in front of that judge and spoke truth to power. About how sometimes, just sometimes, the right words in the right moment can change everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened, two people who'd found each other across impossible distances and built a life that proved love was stronger than hate, that bridges were stronger than walls, that the land really did remember. And in the morning they would tell the rest of the story. 1919, Red Canyon Ranch, morning. The boy found his grandfather already on the porch when he came outside at dawn, coffee steaming in the cool morning air. Jacob looked tired, the kind of tired that came from sleepless nights spent remembering things best left in the past. "Couldn't sleep?" the boy asked. "Dreams," Jacob said simply. "About the trial. Still dream about it sometimes, even after 20 years. The boy settled into his chair, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders against the chill. In the distance, Naomi was already working in the garden, her movements steady and purposeful, despite her 48 years. "Tell me," the boy said. Jacob took a long sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts. The trial was set for the first week of October 1899 in Santa Fe, Judge Harrison Whitmore presiding. He was 62 years old, territorial appointment with a reputation for being hard but fair. Curtis Mallory had Vernon Blake as his lawyer, plus 2 assistants from back east. I had myself and the truth. And the elders. "And the elders," Jacob agreed. 15 Apache witnesses, Sarah with her deed and her mother's blessing, Thomas in his cavalry uniform, lending us legitimacy whether we wanted it or not. We rode into Santa Fe like a traveling show, and people stared like they'd never seen such a sight. October 1899. Santa Fe. The territorial courthouse was an adobe building 2 stories tall, with thick walls that kept it cool even in summer heat and warm in winter cold. The courtroom itself was simple. Wooden benches, a judge's bench carved from pine windows that let in harsh mountain light. Jacob stood at the defendant's table in his best shirt, the one Margaret had made him years ago, now carefully mended and pressed. Beside him sat Samuel Ironwood, who'd insisted on being there even though he had no official role. Behind them, the 15 elders sat in silent dignity, their traditional clothing a stark contrast to the suits and dresses of the townspeople who'd packed the gallery. Naomi sat in the front row directly behind Jacob, where he could feel her presence like a physical thing. Thomas sat beside her in full uniform, his sergeant's stripes visible to everyone, a silent statement that not all Apache were enemies of the government. Curtis Mallory sat across the aisle with Vernon Blake and the Eastern lawyers, looking confident and expensive. He'd barely glanced at Jacob when they entered, as if the outcome was already decided, and this was just formality. Judge Whitmore entered, and everyone stood. The judge was tall and lean, with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He settled into his chair, surveyed the courtroom, and frowned slightly at the unusual crowd. "This is a civil matter regarding property title," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Not a social gathering. I'll have order and decorum, or I'll clear this courtroom. Is that understood?" Murmurs of agreement. "Mr. Blake, you filed the challenge. Present your case." Blake stood smoothing his expensive suit and began to speak. His voice was smooth, educated, designed to impress. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of law. When Margaret Hartwell passed away in 1884, the property jointly owned with her husband should have been either formally transferred to him alone or reverted to her legal heirs. According to county records, neither action was taken. The title remains in question, and my client, Mr. Mallory, as a concerned citizen and adjacent landowner, has brought this matter to the court's attention for proper resolution." Blake pulled out documents, county records, showing Jacob's original filing in 1877 and the absence of any refiling after Margaret's death. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the original claim itself has irregularities. It passes through Margaret Hartwell's grandmother, one Dawn Walker, who was Apache. Apache land ownership was not recognized under territorial law in 1877. Therefore, the chain of title is broken from the start. The land should revert to the territory for proper distribution." Blake sat down, looking satisfied. It was a good argument, Jacob had to admit. Clean legal, almost impossible to counter without documentation that didn't exist. Almost. Judge Whitmore looked at Jacob. "Mr. Hartwell, you're representing yourself. Do you wish to respond?" Jacob stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly. He'd never been comfortable with public speaking, preferred to let his actions talk instead of his words. But this was different. This was fighting for everything that mattered. Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a rancher. I built Red Canyon Ranch with my wife 22 years ago. We built it on land her grandmother gave us as a wedding gift, blessed by both Apache tradition and white man's law. I buried my wife there 15 years back. That land has my sweat and my blood and my tears soaked into every acre. And I'll be damned if I let lawyers and technicalities steal what we built with our hands. Watch your language, Mr. Hartwell, the judge said mildly. Apologies, Your Honor, but I mean every word. Whitmore's expression didn't change. Do you have evidence to support your claim? I do. I'd like to call my first witness, Reverend Thomas Grain. The old reverend stood from the gallery, walked to the witness stand with the careful steps of a man in his 60s who'd felt every year. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Jacob approached him holding a piece of paper. Reverend Grain, do you recognize this document? The reverend adjusted his spectacles. I do. That's the marriage certificate I issued for Jacob Hartwell and Margaret White Deer in August of 1877. Margaret's full name was White Deer. That was her birth name, yes. White Deer, daughter of Morning Rain and granddaughter of Don Walker. She took the name Margaret when she attended missionary school, but legally her Apache name remained valid. Blake stood. Objection, Your Honor. Apache names have no legal standing. They do when they're on official documents signed by a recognized reverend, Whitmore said dryly. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Hartwell. Jacob turned back to Reverend Grain, who attended this wedding. Margaret's family, her Aunt Sarah, her grandmother Dawn Walker, several other relatives, and Jacob's friend Samuel Ironwood. It was done proper according to both Christian and Apache custom. And the land, was there discussion of land? There was. Dawn Walker formally gifted the Red Canyon property to the couple as a wedding present. She had owned it since before the territory was even organized, back when Apache people still had sovereignty over their traditional lands. The gift was witnessed and blessed. Blake objected again, arguing that Apache land ownership wasn't legally valid, but the reverend had already planted the seed. This wasn't just about paperwork. This was about people and promises and traditions that preceded the law, trying to erase them. Jacob called Samuel Ironwood next. Samuel testified about helping build the ranch, about continuous occupation, about improvements worth thousands of dollars, about never seeing the land abandoned or unused. Then Elena Torres, who brought 20 years of ledgers showing Jacob's purchases, his credit history, his active management of a working ranch. But the real moment came when Jacob called Sarah Wakinian to the stand. The old woman walked forward slowly, guided by Naomi, her near-blind eyes looking at nothing and everything. She sat in the witness chair with the dignity of a queen. And when the interpreter asked if she would tell the truth, she responded in Apache with words that rang through the courtroom like prophecy. The interpreter translated. She says, I speak truth because the land demands it. I speak for my mother who can no longer speak. I speak for blood and earth and promises that white man's law tries to bury. Blake stood to object, but Whitmore held up a hand. I want to hear this. Continue. Through the interpreter, Sarah told her story about her mother, Dawn Walker, medicine woman and landowner, long before territorial law existed, about the blessing she gave to Margaret and Jacob, about the vision she had in her final days. And then Sarah produced the deed. The courtroom went silent as the document was handed to Judge Whitmore. He examined it carefully, holding it up to the light, studying the signatures and the Apache symbols at the top. This appears to be a legal deed, Whitmore said slowly, signed by Dawn Walker, Margaret Hartwell, Jacob Hartwell, and witnessed by Samuel Ironwood and Reverend Grain. The date is August 1877, before Mrs. Hartwell's death. Mr. Blake, why wasn't this in the county records? Blake looked genuinely surprised. He'd clearly never expected this document to exist. Your Honor, I have no knowledge of this deed. It may be a forgery. "It's not a forgery," Reverend Grain called from the gallery. "I witnessed it myself. I can verify every signature on that paper." Whitmore studied the deed again, his finger tracing the Apache symbols. "What do these marks say?" Sarah responded through the interpreter. "They say, 'This land is blessed by Dawn Walker. It is given in love to her granddaughter and to the man who showed honor. The earth knows their blood now. The earth will remember." Something shifted in the courtroom. You could feel it, a change in the air, like weather turning. These weren't just words on paper. This was covenant, witnessed by earth and spirit and law all at once. Blake tried to recover. "Your Honor, even if this deed is authentic, it doesn't resolve the fundamental issue. Apache land ownership wasn't recognized in 1877. This deed, while perhaps morally compelling, has no legal weight." "That's where you're wrong, Counselor," Whitmore said quietly. He set the deed down and looked out at the courtroom. In 1877, when this deed was executed, the White Mountain Apache had a treaty with the territorial government. That treaty, while later broken and superseded, was legal and binding at the time. It recognized Apache sovereignty over certain lands, including the area now known as Red Canyon. Dawn Walker's ownership under that treaty was legitimate. Blake's face went pale. "Furthermore," Whitmore continued, "even if we set aside the question of Apache ownership, this deed represents a valid transfer of property between Dawn Walker and her granddaughter Margaret, who then shared ownership with her husband Jacob Hartwell. The deed is signed, witnessed, and dated. The absence of this document from county records is a clerical error, not a legal invalidation." The judge looked at Jacob. "Mr. Hartwell has occupied, improved, and maintained this property continuously for 22 years. Under the doctrine of adverse possession, even if there were title questions, they would be resolved in his favor by virtue of open, notorious, and continuous use." He turned to Blake. "Your client's claim that the land should revert to the territory for redistribution is denied. The title is valid. The deed will be filed with the county immediately." Mallory stood up, his face red. "This is a travesty. That land is worth 10 times what Hartwell could ever—" "Mr. Mallory, sit down and be quiet, or I'll hold you in contempt." Mallory sat, but his eyes promised murder. Whitmore wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into the barn fire at Red Canyon Ranch and the reported ambush of Miss Whitefeather on the trail to White Mountain. Mr. Blake, if your client was involved in criminal intimidation or violence, he will face charges. Sheriff, please escort Mr. Mallory into custody pending investigation." The courtroom erupted. Mallory shouted protests. Blake demanded this was overreach, but Whitmore's gavel came down like thunder. "Order, this court is adjourned." Jacob stood motionless, unable to fully process what had just happened. They'd won. Not just won, but won completely, with the judge himself ordering investigations into Mallory's crimes. Naomi appeared beside him, her hand finding his. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it. You found Sarah. You brought the deed. We did it together." The elders filed past each one, touching Jacob's shoulder or nodding their respect. Sarah paused, her blind eyes somehow finding his face. "My mother's vision was true," she said through the interpreter. "The land remembers, and now white man's law remembers too." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some angry, some supportive, most just curious. Thomas stood in his cavalry uniform, a visible reminder that not all Apache were enemies, that some served in the very government trying to erase them. A reporter from the Santa Fe newspaper pushed forward. "Mr. Hartwell, what do you want people to know about this case?" Jacob looked at Naomi, at Sarah, at the 15 elders who'd traveled so far to speak truth. "I want people to know that this land doesn't belong to any one person or any one people. It belongs to those who love it enough to fight for it. My wife was Apache. Her grandmother was Apache. That doesn't make the land less American. It makes it more American. Because America is supposed to be about people from different worlds coming together and building something new. And Miss Whitefeather. What's her role in all this?" Jacob took Naomi's hand openly in front of everyone. She's the woman I'm going to marry, if she'll have me." Naomi looked at him, surprise and joy warring on her face. "Are you asking?" "I am." "Then I'm saying yes." They kissed there on the courthouse steps, and the reporter's pencil flew across his notebook, recording a moment that would become legend in its own right. The hermit of Red Canyon and the Apache healer, the flood that brought them together twice, the land that remembered. 1919. The porch. "You married her right there?" the boy asked. 3 weeks later, Jacob said. "Right under the cottonwood where Margaret was buried. Reverend Grain performed the ceremony. Samuel stood up with me. Thomas gave Naomi away. The 15 elders attended, along with Elena Torres and half of Copper Springs, including some folks who'd been against us at the start but came around after the trial." "What about Mallory?" "Served 2 years in territorial prison for arson and attempted intimidation. Lost everything when the railroad went a different route, entirely nowhere near Red Canyon. Vernon Blake left the territory. Last I heard, he was practicing law in California. Sheriff Cole retired in 1902, couldn't look himself in the mirror after letting Mallory get away with so much for so long. Reverend Grain kept marrying couples, Apache and white, until he passed in 1905. Elena Torres ran her store another 15 years, became the keeper of our story, told it to anyone who'd listen." The boy nodded, satisfied. "And the land," Jacob smiled, looking out at the ranch that spread before them. "We built on it. Your grandmother planted orchards, started a school for Apache and white children together, taught medicine to anyone who wanted to learn. We had 3 children, your mother being the oldest. They married, had children of their own. Now we've got grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and every one of them knows the story of how this place came to be." Naomi emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Are you filling that boy's head with stories again? Just telling him the truth. The truth has a way of sounding like stories when you've lived long enough." She sat down beside Jacob, and the boy watched his grandparents, seeing them not just as the old people who raised vegetables and told tales, but as the young people they'd been. Jacob, at 45, pulling a woman from 20 years of searching into his arms. Naomi, at 28, riding alone through dangerous country to save a man's land claim. Heroes, he realized. Not the kind in books who fought dragons and rescued princesses. The real kind who fought injustice and prejudice and their own fears, who built bridges instead of walls, who proved that love was stronger than hate. "The land remembers," the boy said softly, repeating Sarah's words. "It does," Jacob agreed. "Every promise kept, every seed planted, every child born here. This earth is soaked with stories, our story, and someday yours." The sun climbed higher in the autumn sky. In the distance, children's voices carried from the school Naomi had built. A mix of Apache and English, of old ways and new. The orchards were heavy with fruit. The fences were straight and strong. Above the graves, the old tree stood unchanged, its roots holding centuries of memory. And on the porch of Red Canyon Ranch, 3 generations sat together, connected by blood and story and land that remembered everything. The land that had known flood and fire, hate and love loss and redemption. The land that had brought a man and a woman together across impossible distance twice. The land that would stand long after they were all gone, holding their stories in soil and stone, and the roots of trees that would shade children not yet born. The land that, as Dawn Walker had prophesied 60 years before, she was proven right, knew their blood now, and would remember. Always. Epilogue. The reporter's story ran in the Santa Fe newspaper the next week, picked up by papers across the territory. It told of an Apache healer who'd searched 20 years to repay a debt of a hermit rancher who'd found love again, of a trial that challenged the very notion of who could own land and who belonged on it. Some people read it and saw a threat to the natural order. Others read it and saw hope. But Jacob and Naomi didn't read it at all. They were too busy building the life they'd fought for, planting trees, mending fences, teaching children, loving each other with the fierce, tested love of people who knew exactly what they'd almost lost. The school Naomi built opened in spring of 1900. 6 Apache children, 4 white children learning together in a building Jacob constructed from timber cut on their own land. By 1905, there were 20 students. By 1910, 40. The orchards came next. Apple trees first, then peach, then pear. Naomi grafted them herself, using techniques her grandmother had taught her, mixing old Apache knowledge with new farming methods. Within 5 years, Red Canyon Ranch was known throughout the territory not just for cattle, but for fruit that tasted like hope. On quiet evenings, they would sit under the cottonwood tree and Jacob would talk to Margaret's grave, telling her about Naomi, about the life they were building, about how her blessing had made all of it possible. And sometimes, when the wind moved through the branches just right, it almost seemed like she was answering, telling him she was proud, telling him she'd known even in her final days that the right person would come, that the land would remember, that love in the end was the only thing strong enough to bridge any divide. 20 years later, when Jacob was 65 and Naomi was 48, they would sit on that same porch and tell their grandson this story, and he would carry it forward, telling it to his own children, who would tell it to theirs. The story of the flood that saved a child, the promise that brought her back, the land that remembered, and the love that proved once and for all that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost, no matter the odds. Some things, like the land itself, endure. The end.